Start off by saying good afternoon and thank you for joining today. Today is going to be the final session of the reading group series on taking juvenile justice seriously, which has featured the author of the book, Dr. Chris Sullivan. We are excited to have with us today several leaders from Utah's juvenile justice system who will be taking part in a panel discussion. The purpose of the discussion is to take stock of how Utah's juvenile justice system aligns with a developmentally responsive approach while considering some of the key topics and themes from the book. So before we begin, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce some of the panelists that will be joining us. So we have with us Dr. Chris Sullivan. As I mentioned, he's the author of the book that we've talked about over the last couple of sessions, and he's the associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice at the University of Cincinnati. We also have with us Tiffany Pugh, who is the assistant juvenile court administrator in Utah. Joining her from the administrative office of the courts is Ansley Dille, who is a program coordinator. I believe we have Brett Peterson on here, who is the director of juvenile justice services. And then finally, Pam Vickrey, who is the executive director of Utah Juvenile Defender Attorneys. So thank you to the panelists for agreeing to participate in today's discussion. We're glad to have you here with us and look forward to hearing from you all. I asked that if audience members have questions for the panelists or just in general, if you could please submit those through the chat feature. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible near the end of today's session if we have time. If not, I will arrange to try to answer some of those via email and through some follow-up. So I wanted to begin today's discussion by asking the panelists, what are some of the ways that the juvenile justice system in Utah is developmentally responsive in its juvenile justice practices?
Anyone? Who's going to go first?
Thanks, Pam.
Like you are, Pam.
Okay, well, here I go then. So I'm a defense attorney, as Derek said. My office represents kids in juvenile court. And so I'm coming at it from that perspective about how we're seeing kids handle the courtroom setting and how they're responding to orders and things like that. So some of the things I think I would say that we are doing well in the developmentally appropriate response is it's talked about, I think, in the previous two sessions, really making sure that we're doing things through enhancing our diversion programs. But there's also been other things I think that we have done well. We still have a lot of work to do, but we have done well in terms of recognizing what kids can really actually internalize as connecting an order to the behavior. So we took steps to reduce how many community service hours could be ordered or how much of a fine should be ordered, creating timelines for how long kids can spend under the jurisdiction of the juvenile court system. Because when you really talk to young people, they need to be able to see and understand where there is an end to something. And so I think that we've seen some real positives there. I think that we have continued work to do with that, but we've taken some significant steps. So that's my kickoff.
Thanks, Pam.
Thanks, Pam, for breaking the ice. I'll piggyback a little on that too. Of just, I think there's some fundamentals that I think sometimes we take for granted. I see a few names down on the list of people I recognize who maybe don't take this for granted, but just how far juvenile justice has come. I remember, vividly being at one of our facilities and the facility director there sharing about what it was like when she started in juvenile justice, and it was like 20 years before. And the youth were in jumpsuits and they were lined up and they were, marched in a line, different ways. And Pam, I know, thinking of like legislation here in Utah to not shackle youth coming into the courtroom, looking at all of our treatment through the lens of kind of this positive youth development approach, and really questioning, I guess you'd say punitive responses. So in other words, everything in our system, with the last few years of reform, typically it's trying to look through this lens of public safety, because I was actually just talking to someone before this call about this, like what other things are you impacting by introducing a young person into some of these settings? Like that in and of itself is just this traumatic occurrence, and I don't think is developmentally appropriate. Like I don't think when I was growing up there wasn't a time where my dad was like, well, maybe he did, but he wasn't backed by research. But there wasn't a time that my dad said, you need to go spend a night in a locked cell. You know what I mean? Like that's not good for my development. And so the juvenile systems have in Utah, we've continued to kind of weigh this balance of when is it worth that, I guess you'd say. And fundamentally, hopefully, we continue to push to say it's only when we're kind of facing some kind of imminent public harm type scenarios. Otherwise, you're not being very developmentally appropriate. Like you can create all the trauma-informed care you want. And then I think that is the other side of it is continually trying to create environments where there is youth voice, where like I know, like in our secure settings, our long-term settings, the fundamental work there is treatment. It's working with the youth in evidence-based treatment. It's not about warehousing, things like that. So still a lot of work to be done, but I do think those reform efforts and practice changes as well, so policy and practice, that have helped us on that path.
And as Pam stated, we have significantly increased our diversion practices and programs through juvenile court. The majority of the youth who are referred to us are given a non-judicial agreement, so an agreement outside of court to resolve the allegations that or charges they've been referred on. There have been statutory changes where youth under the age of 12 can't be petitioned to court, that even if they have, unless they're specific felonies, some very serious felonies, but overall, they will receive a non-judicial agreement. And we've put together processes in which those kids can receive the same interventions and have their needs met without ever having to go before a judge, go into court, have that in-court experience that doesn't necessarily help them to not reoffend in the future. It's really getting those interventions that and individualizing that to each kid's needs, whether or not they go to court or they're successful in this diversion process. And Ansley can probably speak a little more on the other, developmentally appropriate responses that our probation officers and our staff are utilizing.
The things I was just thinking about when Pam and Brett especially were talking about, when we think about how we've implemented evidence-based practices in the juvenile court, is we know so much more now about how we can further those evidence-based practices to be responsive to adolescents and to juveniles more, when a lot of that research was done originally on adults, right? And so we at the probation department have really tried to incorporate a lot of that, of what we do, into our case planning model. And when we meet with youth and families, having that gender specific approach, a lot of the things that we've implemented, especially with JJS and our case planning model, really take into account that cognitive functioning of those adolescents and how probation officers and our JJS workers can really meet the kids where they're at in regards to their processing and what's going on with them, and try not to disrupt those positive things that they do have going on, but also rehabilitate and provide that intervention rather than those punishments and sanctions like we were talking about. In probation, we've implemented a targeted response model that's really specific to adolescent development and how often we should be delivering incentives that are appropriate to them and their ages and the things that are important to them that are different. We know, right, that juveniles are motivated differently to change their behavior than adults are. So those are some of the things that we've incorporated into our day-to-day support of how we work with the kids on probation and even in their diversions and the non-judicial process. We do that. So.
Thank you all. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely been a lot of progress. I mean, a number of important things came up in the discussion there. The I think really does well and kind of aligning with a developmentally responsive approach. So with that in mind, I kind of wanted to bring up the flip side of that. What are some of the ways that the system can improve to better align with a developmentally responsive approach? So thinking about your experiences and knowledge of the system and kind of where the progress is currently, what are some areas that still could use some additional work, maybe to better align with that?
Well, I'll just jump in again because everyone that knows me knows I just will talk your ear off. I think some of the things that, again, from my perspective, are still hard is there's always this constant question of what is the difference between a rehabilitative order and what is the difference between a consequence, right? And the problem with juvenile court is that at the end of the day, it's hard to ask the court to not be a court, right? So we've got kids that are coming in that we're dealing with and for behaviors that are problematic, but not necessarily outside of normative behavior, right? Whether that's normative sexual behavior or just normal adolescent behavior in terms of a lot of the stuff that that Christopher talked about in the two previous presentations, right? About impulsivity and all these, and risk reward and all these other types of things. And so we're seeing kids through that lens, but then there's still a public perception of, okay, but how did the court act like a court about it, right? And there's a real disconnect still, I think, between the public at large understanding that the juvenile court system's responses and interventions are driven by a rehabilitative intervention rather than a punishment intervention. And so what you hear a lot of people do is you hear people respond with, that's it, that's all that happened, instead of really understanding where it came from and why it was that way. Because, as Brett was saying, his dad didn't send him to the juvenile detention center. And I think sometimes we see kids even that don't go through diversion that still come to court that quite frankly still don't need a consequence, right? Like just coming and going through the process is enough. But because there is this perception and this need that we need to intervene in this other way. And I think that is always a real struggle because, when you're talking about, like, for example, detention, in my view, detention should only be used if there is a public safety risk for absolutely no other reason. If there is a public safety risk, that is the only time that we should be looking at detention. But it is still very, very hard for all of us because it's human nature to separate out what is, am I doing this because there's a public safety risk? Or am I doing this because I'm mad at this kid? Or am I doing this because, quite frankly, I'm at my wit's end and I don't know what else to try? Which I think we see sometimes too. The last thing that I'll just hit on is that I think that we could do a better job of interacting with helping victims understand what the juvenile justice system does well. What I see a lot, particularly when you're talking about very, very serious offenses with young people or cases with regards to transfer, is a lot of talking to victims about this is all that's going to happen. They're not going to be held accountable, that the adult system is really the only way to lower the boom on a kid. And we do a very poor job of explaining to people that the juvenile justice system actually does a very, very good job of intervening with young people. We need to do a lot better job, but the juvenile justice system is well equipped to deal with kids, even with kids with very serious offenses. And then we need to separate out what is the offense and what is the child. But that we actually do a good job interacting with that population. We can do, like I said, we have a lot to do better, but the adult system clearly is not a good answer for that population.
I guess we'll go in order. No, kidding. Tiffany, you should go.
I couldn't find my unmute, so it's a struggle. It's Monday. But to echo what Pam said, it is really difficult, to grapple with finding that balance between, holding the kid accountable or the young person accountable, and then really not, causing more even harm or damage or raising their risk just because it feels good to punish them, right? There's definitely a piece of it's important to, hold individuals accountable for their behavior, but not at the detriment of increasing their risk and actually like making the situation worse. And I agree that there is a disconnect, particularly with the community. People that work in this field, we always see the new research and how if we do this, it decreases recidivism, but the community doesn't necessarily see that. And sometimes it just feels like it's made much more simplistic in that, oh, if you just punish them, they'll stop, instead of this building their skills on that side. So it is difficult to balance, and particularly, as Pam said, when there are victims involved and there has been, sometimes significant harm done, and you want to balance their interests, again, without harming this youth. So that is really difficult. It's something that we try to balance and work with victims and the community on, but it's an ongoing struggle, I guess, to make sure that everybody's needs are met in the healthiest way.
Can I just chime in with one other thing there? I think, and I don't know, I think Derek, maybe you're going to ask us something about this, but I think one area that we're still also really struggling to implement well is trauma, right? Making sure that every assessment, every evaluation has also a trauma component. But then I think the next question is, where do you go next, right? Like, because what I think in court, what I feel like is we have kids where we say there's been trauma in the person's childhood and this is what it was. But then the interventions that we use, like, it's like, okay, it's there and it might help people understand how we got there or explain why we're there, but then we use all the same interventions. And so I think, like, while we're getting better about talking about trauma and that things should be trauma informed, I think that second step of what is trauma informed intervention is something that there's still a big gap in my mind with.
Yeah, I think my mind was going there a little bit too, Pam. I mean, I think the systems still grapple with the fact that juvenile courts and juvenile justice agencies are still like kind of these de facto, mental behavioral health entities, right? Because still so much of what you're encountering is, because of underlying trauma, underlying mental health. But yet we're still building responses from, this criminal legal system kind of lens. And so like, there's just always this kind of tension there, I think. Another area where I think that we, and this isn't just a Utah only thing, but nationally, the role of group settings, of congregate settings, of residential treatment. I think the research is really shaky on the efficacy of those settings. Yet we are not positioned in a way where we can bifurcate treatment from placement, and so often, certainly we get the assessments we need, I guess you could say, to place a kid somewhere, but really the underlying issue is getting them placed. Like, that's what's driving it, whether it's child welfare or juvenile justice. And when you really start digging into, okay, what are the outcomes in some of those settings, these residential treatment, how and when is residential treatment actually needed versus some type of in-home? And again, I think too, sometimes looking from a court response, what gets blurred into there is maybe the need for supervision, or maybe how many times have we heard, well, the kid needs a timeout, the kid needs to be out of the home, the parents are done. And those things are all true. They're all very, very true. But looking at and saying, okay, let's really focus and what is the treatment need? How do we respond to it? And then thinking if, okay, we need to increase some type of supervision. Treatment settings, they just have made it easy for us for a long time because it's kind of the one size fits all. Cool, they're going, they're there. And everyone knows this, whether you're a case manager or you're a probation officer, it is easier, or if we had DCFS on here, if you're a case worker, it's easier to get a kid into just a placement than it is to, what I mean by versus serving them where they're at from like a case planning perspective. It takes a lot more tools, to say, okay, we're going to keep this kid where they're at, and we're going to start looking at what services and treatment the family needs right there. So I think that's an area where we still have a lot of room to improve.
I'm going to jump in one last time, then I promise I'll stop. I promise. But the other thing is, I think we still are struggling, and I don't, is, one, we still know that we have very significant overrepresentation of children of color within the system. And so I think that that's something that we also are continuing, that we need to continue to work on, is one, how and why is that happening? But two, what is our cultural awareness and our cultural consciousness with regards to the kids that we interact with, and how their family dynamics or their family, their culture and things like that guides or structures the way that they interact with the JJ system.
I was just going to respond to a couple of points that I thought were interesting, and this kind of goes back to Pam's last point. I think to a couple of the points that have been woven in is the idea of, what's the public's perception of what happens in the juvenile court, and to some extent, I think if you frame it as, well, what would you do sort of in your situation where your child was kind of acting up, and then tie it to the kind of philosophy that Brett was talking about. I think that makes an important point that resonates. But at the same time, I think when you factor in the idea that you do have a lot of kids in every state really that are kids of color and that are involved in the system, I think it becomes easier to kind of view them as the other and not sort of connected to what you would do maybe with your children. And so I think that's some of the disconnect that's happened with the juvenile system over time in terms of these types of responses and this idea of kids getting off easy or ineffective responses, when we know that the system is doing reasonably well, especially given the nature of the cases and the volume of the cases that it sees. But there is, I think, need maybe to tell that story a little bit better. The other thing I think that was interesting is the combination across all of the answers, both in terms of what's going well and then also some things that needs to happen, of kind of the day-to-day practical routine interactions with youth, and then also kind of the big picture initiatives, the reform to reduce state level residential placements, that type of thing. And so I think that it's interesting just that there's always that component of like, well, what's happening just in terms of how are we interacting with youth in a routine capacity, but then also what are some of the big picture initiatives that we're undertaking in order to make the system a bit more developmental, more evidence-based.
Thank you all for that. So switching gears a bit, I wanted to kind of talk about risk need assessments. How are they currently used in the juvenile justice process here in Utah? And maybe just kind of explain, I assume most folks on the call probably know what factors are included in the PSRA and the PRA, which are used here, but just kind of maybe talk a little bit about those, how they guide decision-making in the system. So thinking from all the way from dispositions to treatment plans, referrals to service providers and monitoring outcomes. And then maybe think about what other information might be important to include or be collected as part of the assessment process that could also help to promote public safety and positive youth development.
I can jump off with this one, since we at the Juvenile Court Probation Department sort of take that from the beginning and usually are making those initial decisions. But as Derek mentioned, we have the PSRA and PRA, which are our risk and need assessments that we use in the juvenile court. We use the PSRA really to decide what happens next with a kid when they come into the court, it determines what their risk level is, their risk to recidivate. And so then that helps us to decide, is this a kid that we should be offering a diversion to? Is this a kid that we should be providing more intensive intervention to? Is this someone who needs more services, right? It's really just a quick snapshot at the beginning of their case, or every time they really come into the system, we update that. But to help us know what's next, what decisions do we make next to help this kid? If they're low risk, that usually means diversion, little intervention. We usually give, a consequence or some type of responsibility they have to complete for that accountability piece, right? But they don't work a lot with us at that point. Unless there are some small cases like where other assessments are required where we do have to work with them. But in regards to risk to recidivate, that's what happens with the PSRA. If they are moderate or high risk, then that tells us, right, the youth needs more intervention and we need to dig further to find out what they need. And so at that point, probation officers, if they're moderate or high risk, will do our PRA assessment that will determine not only what their risk level is or give us more information about their risk, but also tell us what their dynamic and static risk factors are so that we can start building a case plan. So that really helps us to do a few different things, obviously, to help determine how often we're going to be talking with them and meeting with them and providing intervention. It helps us to know what those priority risk factors are so we can get them to the right interventions to really help them. Is there stuff going on in the family that's leading to their involvement with the court system, or is there stuff going on with their drug use that's leading to that? And so we can get them to those right interventions. And then we also build structured case plans for the youth that support those risk factors. And so it not only details what the intervention is the kid's going to do, but how our probation officers are going to support them. And I'll let Brett talk more about what JJS does with them, but it talks really about how probation can support them, what community partners and their families can do to support them, and what specifically, if they were to make improvements to those risk factors, what that behavior would look like and what those benefits would be to them long-term. And it really shapes how we work with them throughout the rest of our system. So that's how we use it in probation.
I'm definitely not the expert from my shop, but I'm not the only one from my shop but I'm the only one on the panel. So, I know that all of our, our case planning is driven by our PRA from the very core of it. And then all the way into, as they come into secure care, their treatment approach and everything that's kind of tracked and delivered from there is driven by the PRA. And so literally we have a pretty sophisticated behavioral management system, and each youth, it's clear, here's the risk items, here's the dosage, going to be delivered for these risk items, and then we can kind of track it, monitor it across the way. Any further beyond that for me, I definitely would just be just throwing things out there. So I'll kind of keep it at that super high level. One thing though, Derek, that you said that, and I think in a way that this exists in the PRA in the PSRA because we have protective factors, but really, like, I think it'd be cool to shift the kind of the paradigm of what's their potential to thrive, or what do we need to help get out of the way so they can thrive, instead of everything just couched in this risk to reoffend. Like, I think that's kind of I don't know if it's a shortcoming. I also know, like, I get it. I just got done with the legislative session and I have to be on the Hill, and, they're fundamentally looking, the recidivism question is always going to come up. But how can we push back on that and fight ourselves out of that corner and do it with research and do it with data that shows, look, let's give some context to this discussion around recidivism. Let's give some context in looking at broader family systems and communities and generational trauma and all these things that kind of start weaving into it. And how are we now helping? We recognize a youth's come here, here's a touch point, but now what can we do to help them thrive? I think will be a cool kind of framework. Tiffany. Was,
What
don't
Ansley
throw you on the
said,
spot.
can I just say
what
that?
Ansley said. You can.
No, I really love that idea of shifting the focus a bit more to those protective factors. Since, we do focus really on that risk. That's what, okay, well, are they going to, reoffend? What's the recidivism rate? But recidivism in and of itself is just a very complex metric, right? It's like, okay, is it, any referral? If you had a kiddo that came in 4 years ago for a second-degree felony, and now they're back for a curfew, is that really recidivism? Is that a negative mark? Or is that not something we really, is that a success in a lot of ways? So yeah, but that idea of really, supporting those protective factors, those positive things in their life, in the skills they have, in their, personalities, just their strengths in general, and building on those is, an excellent, it's definitely a much more positive route to go in. And as we use our targeted response, our incentives based responses for kids, really that's what we're doing, is we're focusing on, hey, you made these positive changes and way to go, and we're going to reward you for that. So, and that's been shown to work much better than this punishment of don't do this, focusing on the, yeah, keep doing this. So
I just want to tack on one little thing that's just this is just like amusing in my own mind, but I often think, like, if all of a sudden there was like a blip and we lost all our institutional knowledge on, criminal justice systems in general, but really in juvenile justice, like, what would we build, and would it look like what we have now? Like, I just think that everything we have, whether it's from research to assessments to treatment, it's still carrying like decades of baggage, good or bad. I'm not saying it's all bad, but it's still coming from this kind of historical perspective, which I think any system does, right? But I just think it's often interesting, because I want to pause and I think, like, I don't know, like, what would all of a sudden, if we just didn't know all this, and we had to, how are we going to respond to youth engaging in certain behaviors? I think it'd be interesting to, I don't know, think about. So.
Are you saying, Brett, what if we just, the system as it is ceased to exist and we had to rebuild it fresh? Is that what you're? Okay.
Yeah, that's how I kind of think about it sometimes.
Yeah. It's an interesting kind of thought experiment to go through. What would be the things that we would do or prioritize?
I agree. Yeah, that's how I like to think of it that way. Prioritize. Like, there's going to be some that we still see. Okay, this situation, you're still going to need to have a youth in this scenario, but all these other things, I always am interested on how much is just kind of holdovers, or they've just been kind of incorporated into the institution. When I speak of that, a much broader institution, speaking of.
Yeah, thank you all for that. And Brett, to your one question, we'll kind of follow up with in a bit when I want to get to kind of implementation and buy-in. You'd mentioned something kind of shifting some of the focus away from that risk to recidivism to more kind of strengths-based or looking at protective factors. So when we kind of start talking about implementation in a bit, I do want to circle back to that point. But I think that there's a lot of interesting things, with the comments that were made about risk assessments, especially in that regard. I know that, Chris, I don't know if you've looked at this with some of the work that you've done in Ohio, but how they actually use the strengths component of the OYAs that they use there. But I don't know if there's anything relevant there that you might want to kind of talk about, whether it's used or how it's used, or from some of that work.
I think what I would say is it speaks a little bit to Brett's point, is that we still do very much lead with risk. And so, there is a component there where in the tool here in Ohio, which is being used in other states, where you can kind of fill in a strength, or you can identify something that's protective. And it actually, I was surprised when we looked at our data for a pretty large study, as to how much it was used. But I think a lot of times it was just the flip side of a risk. It wasn't necessarily something that was, you know, indistinguishable from that paradigm or that framework for, understanding both where the youth is at, what their potential is, if given the right support and the right intervention. It was still very risk-based. So I think from that standpoint, it is actually, I think there's an attempt to turn the ship, but it's going to take some time. And I think it also, the incentives, as was mentioned, the incentives run toward, especially with state legislatures, really trying to satisfy the public safety criteria and the perception, as we've already talked about, that maybe the system isn't doing enough on that side of things. So I think there's constantly that tension. And what we've seen is that strength information maybe isn't as good as it could be. And that's going to take, I think, some time to implement and work with.
I was thinking, Chris, when you were just saying that, I didn't mention it, but when we also score for protective items in our assessment, and we build that into the case plan. And I think it really speaks to what you were just saying about, I think that I guess everything comes back to that kind of public perception. Now that I'm thinking about it, everything I want to say kind of comes back to that, because I think there's a lot of emerging research about positive youth development, right? And how evidence-based practices are a good solid groundwork to have, but there's more to a youth than just their risk, right? Like what you were just saying. And we try to build that into what we do. I think part of the hard part sometimes is that we have an expectation from a lot of people that aren't doing the work, that we have a short period of time to make things better. We have a short period of time to hold them accountable. Plus we need to create this long lasting change. And so I think sometimes as a system, it's hard to prioritize how we balance it all, especially with what we know about the strengths for the youth. I think that I can speak for probation, that I think that we want to spend the time that we can fostering those positive youth development things. But when we only have a short period of time, say 3 months, to work with a high risk youth, and try to do what we can, unfortunately, because of the other demands, like we were talking about, like those court orders and the other things that they have to do, we don't have the amount of time that we want to focus on those things. And so I think that's something that we could think about as a system, about how we could even collaborate or do that better differently, so that we can better utilize the time that we have, because we do have some time constraints that are imposed on us that I think could be different. We could focus on different things if we had a little more time to build it all into the bigger picture of what we're doing with the youth.
Right. Yeah, time. I mean, the ideal time and resources. I think, to one of the points Brett made earlier, I was thinking about this idea of, it would be great to have. You can't totally divorce the placement from the treatment or the intervention that the youth's going to get, and that becomes a whole other layer of this, in addition to just the fact that there's going to be some some limits on what can be done resource wise.
But in response to that, and there's even a question I think in the chat about in an ideal world for programs and stuff, from my perspective, what I see is kind of what Ansley is talking about. How do we provide the intervention that would be beneficial to this young person? But then we also have these court orders, and we have to get the court orders done, and it's are we doing those things because there's an actual lesson to be learned from the 5 hours of community service? Or are we doing that because that was the accountability piece? Because to me, in juvenile court, there is absolutely no reason to make an order unless you can tie it to a learning experience for the young person. Now, I don't want to discount that there are impacts to victims and things like that that we need to do, but all of the things that we would do with regards to a victim would have a learning impact, right? A letter of apology, participating in victim offender mediation, or being responsible for restitution and things like that. And then we have the interventions in terms of like a counseling or other types of things. But and I'm not saying that community service hours are bad, but I'm just saying, can we tie them to that specific child, right? Your offense is X, and I really think that you would benefit from doing community service hours in this capacity or in this way, right? And so making sure that we're doing those things. And in terms of like, and because in my response to that also, in terms of like in an ideal world for treatment programs, I think we have a lot of stuff that we've been able to shift from juvenile justice reform to front end kids, and really doing a lot more preventative stuff and wraparound for diversion kids. But it's those back end kids that I think that we still have, we could be investing. I mean, we still know, even with kids with very, very serious offenses, pathways to desistance, all of that stuff still applies to a young person, right? Even with a very high risk offense, right? Or an offense that based on the seriousness of the offense, we should hold in detention. But it's like, because this person, it's the same thought process that we had with whether or not you should shackle a young person in the courtroom. Because a person was involved in this behavior yesterday doesn't mean that they present a danger today in the courtroom. And you need to make an order relevant to that child on this day, right? And so to me, where in an ideal world, we would have more wraparound services for kids that do have a serious offense, but in the community, right? Really like more peer mentoring or peer parenting for some of the families. I mean, really, I know this sounds weird, but we have kids who are like just struggling to figure out like, how do I get through school and get my homework done and get it turned in? And if I've got to get to counseling, and who's going to get me there? And I know probation and JJS try really hard to do all of those things and benefit, but there is also the demands of a caseload, right? But I'm just thinking about my own kid. I mean, that kid is 14 and has two parents that are here. And I swear to God, if he could walk from the kitchen into the living room and remember to carry his book in there and bring it back to me, it'd be like my best week ever. I'd be like, all right, we're done. Success for the week, right? And so, I mean, some of this is like just really understanding how much support in terms of just mentorship or interaction, spending time talking to young people and things like that, that I think would be ideal. And like I said, I think that we just need a lot more. We have the ability to offer probation to kids in the community. But I think if we could have a lot more services on the back end for kids that are more high risk, where there could be a more intensive supervision and more intensive services for that young person, so that we could not have to jump to other types of intervention, that would be helpful.
I want to piggyback on that a little, Pam. I think that, well, I had two thoughts. First is talking about on risk assessments, and I don't know, this isn't like, this isn't my I don't have a background in the kind of research perspective, but I think sometimes I feel like risk assessments are, the risk to reoffend is muddied by high risk relative to the type of offense. So because of the seriousness of offense, does that automatically preclude that there's a higher propensity to reoffend? Do you know what I mean? But on these risk assessments, I think, you get a certain point value for murder. Maybe not. Maybe I'm talking outside of my, maybe I'm not making sense here, but it seems like, we automatically assume, okay, with this offense, they're high risk. And it's like, well, high risk for what? Like, what's the underlying question? And how do we make sure those things are clean? On to that, the question on the ideal treatment, I think, Pam, this is where I wanted to piggyback on you. I don't know if I would necessarily look to a treatment per se of saying, oh, this is what we need. I think we do have a lot of formal treatment approaches. I do think it's some of those informal things you're talking about. I was in a presentation, it's a group called Think of Us, and they're, youth who've who've been in child welfare, been in juvenile justice, and listening to their experience. And it was things like, it's just things we completely take for granted, not growing up in institutions. Having a parental figure to teach you how to, make a lunch and how you're going to get ready for school and how you get this thing. You don't learn that when you're in a group home. You don't learn that, when you're in and out of court systems and all these different things. Like, those things start to kind of really get peeled back. And so I think the more we could do of some of those, informal supports, just natural supports, peer-driven supports, mentorship, like you said, coaching type opportunities. I think that's where I still think we're missing. And I get it. For me, I think it makes sense because, again, all of these systems are funded, by taxpayers essentially. So there's this level of accountability. And so what do we always talk about? We're always talking about, well, what's the evidence-based treatment? Because I can show a return on investment. I can demonstrate that to a lawmaker, and I can say, see, look, we're a good steward of your investment. That's harder sometimes when you're saying, hey, let me invest in just creating some kind of a fun opportunity for these youth, and that they can just have a mentor there. And I think you can build the research, and there is research around that. It's not as available, I guess you'd say, and it's something I think we have to keep with that. But that would be if someone in an ideal world, those are the kind of things back into. So kids leaving, secure care or front end, those are the things I would really, I hope to invest in.
Any final thoughts from the panelists on that? I think let's shift gears to kind of, I mentioned we talk a little bit about implementation. So with the recent changes to the juvenile justice policy and practice here, what did the implementation process look like, and what were some of the challenges that maybe hindered the implementation of some promising programs and practices, and maybe just kind of speak to your experience with generating support for new initiatives across all levels. So thinking from kind of the community up to the legislators and key decision makers.
Tiffany, you go first. Go, Tiffany.
I was just going to say, juvenile justice reform, the reform that started in 2017, it really was just a complete paradigm shift for, the entire system. We, with the courts, had started somewhat to make that shift of working towards individualizing our services and our responses to the youth that come in. But, it really was a complete overhaul. And I'm sure you all are well aware that change is just really, really hard. And it's not this linear path of like, okay, this is like what you need to do, and then everybody just falls into line. Like, it's messy. So you make strides forward, and then strides, barriers get thrown up. So, it definitely, it was such a complex undertaking. We really took this, the population of employees, and they've gone from a system where, kids just all go to court to a system where it's presumed they receive non-judicials. And then they needed to wrap their heads around the idea that if just because a kid receives a non-judicial or doesn't go to court, it doesn't mean that they don't necessarily get an intervention. Because pre-reform, really that's how our non-judicials were utilized, is like, you don't do anything with those diverted youth. And it was a shift to, no, we're going to still identify, what their needs are and provide for those needs. We don't need a judge to state that and to address that. So that was a really difficult piece. The other piece was shifting the mindset and the approach on accountability. So previously it was really like, oh, well, the judge is going to hold them accountable. You know, if they're not following through, then we're going to take them into court, and they'll receive more punishment there for not following through. And really, with the reform, there was definitely a shift away from that. We had a lot more kids not going to court. We were focusing on not filing, you know, a contempt or an order to show cause on technical violations, but instead addressing them in other ways outside of court. And that's just a big shift in mindset. So that, I'd say, was pretty much one of the biggest challenges, because a lot of POs would report, hey, there's nothing I can do. My hands are tied. I can't hold this kid accountable. And it was really just, they just didn't know how, because that's not how we had done things for so long. And shifting mindsets and changing approaches, it takes time. But yeah, it's been very complex, and we're still working on these pieces all the time.
I was just going to say, with regards to that, I mean, to Tiffany's point, I mean, it is because it's easier to do some of the things that we were doing, right? It's easier to say, I'm going to give you 5 days in the detention center and that's the consequence, than it is to figure out how to case plan with a young family or with a young kid and their family, right? I mean, those are, and again, back to my own kids, right? Like, I mean, it's easier to take away the iPad as a consequence, but then I got to freaking figure out how to engage with her, because now she doesn't have the iPad to entertain her, right? So I mean, it's like, what's the step after that, right? And sometimes I think one of the things that I think is still a struggle, I mean, I'll just say, like, one of the biggest things that was a huge struggle during reform was shifting schools' positions about what types of interventions and interactions with young people, like, how do you, and it's a challenge, right? Like, how do you resource teachers to be able to deal with a difficult kid or a kid who is disruptive in the classroom and still manage, you know, a classroom of 30 kids and provide all of these things. But so I think one of the things that's still a challenge is, to Tiffany's point, I think the court has really started to make good progress in terms of shifting that mindset. But I think we're still struggling with all of the community partners with that. Like, right, to Chris's point earlier, again, about the perception of how we see the JJ system and what it should be, or what the intervention should be. You know, like, for example, one of the things that I really wanted to talk about this year is, do we need school resource officers in schools, or do we need different resources for our teachers, right? But that was, you know, in a state like Utah, was like, you know, but we're doing all this great work and we have these, and it's like, hey, I'm police officers, that's great, but I don't need you to be there as a school resource officer to do community engagement with my child, right? Like, you need to figure out a different way to do community engagement. And then we need to talk about what is necessary in a school to help teachers interact and do restorative justice and de-escalation and all these other things that are challenges, because they're big shifts away from the way that we normally have done things. Another thing that I think is really a big challenge is that every area has its own way of doing something. And when you look at, like, Brett's group and the court, they're able to do stuff on a state level, right? They're able to say probation is going to interact with these standards and these policies, and this is how we're going to handle intake. And Brett's able to say, this is how JJS is going to respond, and this is what's going on. But once you get outside of that, everything is at a local micro level, right? And every little county, every local school board, every police agency, everybody has their own policies and procedures and their own way of dealing with things. And so recognizing what the challenges are in different areas, but also engaging with people to say, we understand this is the challenge based on the resources in your area, but this is still the reality of what is an intervention with the likelihood of a good outcome versus the likelihood of a bad outcome. So how do we engage with that and recognize that there's all these differences across the state? I mean, like I said, I think it's easier when you look at adult reform, right? Some of the struggles is that there's all these, but we're able in the JJ system to be able to have the benefit of everybody on this panel to be able to say, hey, as a state agency, this is how we're going to handle it, and this is how we're going to move forward. And I don't want to discount the need for local involvement or any of those other things, but I think it's trying to figure out how you engage with local needs and local resources while also trying to do what is massive system change and system overhaul.
I'll just tack on the only little thing that I'll add is I really think that, you know, in talking to other states and other jurisdictions, I mean, the thing that I always stress, which is like a super squishy answer, but I really think it's made the difference in Utah, is the concept of partnership and communication. Like, I don't know how more to stress it. Like, you can get as strategic as you want. You can have great designs and everything, but if you don't have some of those fundamentals of partnership, like, it's going to be more painful. And it'll probably still roll forward because you'll pass laws and all that. But I think that's one thing that has really been an advantage for us when we look at implementation, is that we do have forums where we can meet regularly, you know, with our partners, whether it's courts or, you know, defense and prosecutors. I mean, all of these different bodies. But just be able to talk about, here's the challenges we're seeing, and being very honest too. Like, sometimes there's things, you know, with reform that, you know, maybe it's really putting a high amount of pressure on one point of the system. And, you know, I think it's sometimes you just have to bulldoze, I think, on change. You know, I do think that is a reality. And sometimes you're like, well, I understand there's that pressure, but this is where we got to go. But I really think that we get further when we can come together and say, okay, I hear you, and I see this pressure it's putting on your system, like the schools, for example. How can we help? You know, how can we help? How can we find ways? You know, and we know why we made a law change, so we're not going there. But what other things can we do? And I think that's one thing other states could probably learn from Utah, is that I think that's something we've done well.
Brett, just to quickly follow up, I was just curious, do you find, and I guess this could be for anyone on the panel, but have you found that people are more willing to accept occasionally that time where you just have to sort of override and go forward with something if you've engaged in partnership and communication the rest of the time? You know, so if there is that you know, end where you have to, you know, you just have to bulldoze, as you said, does having buy-in on everything else help?
I think so, for sure. I mean, because I think, and it's the same for me too. Like, if I'm in that setting, and like, let's say there's something I'm just really frustrated with the courts about, you know, because that's just like a weekly. No, just kidding. It's really not a weekly occurrence. But like Tiffany and Ansley and Nada, they've been such trustworthy, you know, ethical, consistent partners. So that if all of a sudden they were like, Brett, we can't do that, like, I know, you know what I mean? Like, I trust their, it's just like basic, you know, that's why it's interesting. Like, systems are just reflections of what we deal with, you know, interpersonal relationships, all those things, and it's a bigger thing, but it's still, those things are at the core, I think. So yes, I absolutely think that it makes a difference.
The other thing, well, actually, it looks like we're out of time. I know we probably could continue this discussion, you know, for another couple of hours probably. But I think, you know, with the time being close to 1 here, probably wrap it up. I just wanted to say thanks to all the panelists, and wanted to see if you all had any final thoughts before we conclude.
Just thanks for having us and having this opportunity to, you know, discuss what our current state is, where we've been, and, you know, where we're going. I think it's great to be able to, this is that community building that Brett kind of alluded to, and the building those relationships to. So I'm thankful of everyone who joined in today to, hear about kind of what's happening and have a better understanding of, where we are as a system.
I'll add my thanks too. This is great. I really appreciated being able to hear from all of the amazing sort of experts in Utah on these topics. I have pages and pages of notes here, so thank you. And thanks to everyone too for participating and for coming the last couple of weeks as well. I really appreciate it.